Let's talk about the talent that Paul Chryst left on the roster is going to play a massive role in the 2024 season and why this season will be a bit of an end of an era.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Badger fans, what is going on? Welcome to Locked On Badgers. I'm your host, Ryan Harings, your team every single day. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're an everydayer, you are incredible, you're awesome, and you are appreciated. And for everyone else tuning in, listening, thank you for giving us a slice of your time. It is incredibly appreciated. Today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at FanDuel. Make every moment more. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a bonus or a boost daily. That's right, all summer long, every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Okay. One of the narratives we've seen a lot is how barren or not barren the cupboard was post Paul Chryst. Like, how much talent did he leave or not leave? I think that discussion gets a little off track at times because multiple things can be true. I do think the change needed to be made. I do think Paul Chryst is starting to trend downwards, death by 1,000 cuts type of thing. And I think Luke Fickell was an absolute home run hire, and he's upgraded in spots that this program desperately needed. Recruiting department, strength and conditioning. I like the assistant coaching hires, and they brought recruiting to a new level, right? They absolutely have. I'll yell at anybody and get red in the face if they're trying to tell me recruiting is the same. I don't think it is. Look at the film, look at the offer list, look at the people that they're winning battles against. It has to continue getting better, but he's elevated the program in the short period of time he's been here in several ways. But there was still a lot of talent that Paul Chryst had left on this roster in spots. And when you start to look at this year's iteration of the Wisconsin Badgers, I see 11 guys that were Paul Chryst guys that I think are going to be starters, or almost certainly starters, and another 4 or 5 who are going to be instrumental in the 2D. And there's always a couple other guys that can pop up here or there, maybe a Jace Arnold, maybe that kind of stuff, maybe a Vinny Anthony. So, let's not lose sight of the fact that there's a lot of Paul Chryst talent on this team that we think is going to be better, and lost sometimes in all the excitement of Luke Fickell. And I get excited about Luke Fickell. Like, I get excited about the strength and conditioning department and Max and Pat and the recruiting wins and the transfer wins and the revamped linebacker room. Lost in all that is like, oh yeah, I almost feel like somewhere in the room, a guy like Jake Chaney's raising his hand like, yeah, I mean, I'm still here too, right? A guy like Ches Malusi's like, hey, yeah, I predated some of that. There's a lot of talent on this team. Paul Chryst guys that are going to have to play really well this year for this team to be successful. One of the reasons I've been thinking about this is it kind of dawned on me. This year is kind of the end of the era, right? Paul Chryst left, and that was the official end of the era. But the lasting vestiges of the Paul Chryst regime, and it was a really good regime. Like, it was a really successful period, by the way. But the lasting vestiges of that are slowly fading off the roster, like a ship passing into the night, slowly getting further and further away. This is the last year where you're really going to have a bulk of Paul Chryst guys, So a couple things out of that. The first is this is still very much a work in progress, and fans need to realize that, right? A big chunk of this roster is still people and players, and some really good players, but players that Luke Fickell and this coaching staff inherited and didn't necessarily recruit. Now, it's not to say they wouldn't have. Like, a Luke Fickell would take a Hunter Wohler every single day of the week. They would take a Ches Malusi. They would take a Riley Mahlman, right? Really good players can play for different types of coaches. But it's really the last year where we're going to see this mixed group. Now, there's still going to be Paul Chryst guys on the roster next year, but it's going to start dropping dramatically after this season. Guys like Joe Brunner can still be here. Austin Brown, Vinny Anthony, Riley Nowakowski's a junior or senior. So, yeah, there's still a few. Curtis Neal for sure is a sophomore, guys like that. But this is really the last year of this big mixed group. And I find that really interesting. I'm excited to see how it kind of meshes. I think it's going to be better. I think that group of players that stayed, right, that Paul Chryst recruited group of players, the longer they're kind of in this new culture, the more they're going to be in sync with these new coaches. I think there were issues with that last year where coaches and players were kind of feeling each other out. I think, the players that they've recruited, Luke Fickell and this staff have recruited, they're coming in with a vision of what that staff wants. But when you're recruited by a different staff and then you have a new coach that comes in and the old staff leaves, I think there's a feeling out period. So I'm excited to see maybe this group be a little more in sync this year. And the other thing I think people need to realize is this dinner that Luke Fickell's cooking, like, it's not done yet. Year one was kind of the preheat. You hit the oven to 350. Year two was, you put the pot roast in the oven, right? The pot roast is still cooking. Or do you put the pot roast in the oven or the crock pot? I don't know. Like, people watch the show know I don't really cook. I don't really know where you put a pot roast. I don't even really know what a pot roast is, if I'm being totally serious. I think it's meat and like carrots and gravy. But the bigger point is this thing is still being developed. It's still being cooked. And, Luke Fickell and Phil Longo and Mike Tressel are still kind of cooking with ingredients that they didn't buy at the grocery store with the Paul Chryst guys. So I just find that really interesting that we still have this big mix. And then after this year, right, it really starts to become truly Luke Fickell's program. I mean, it obviously already is, but like down to the players on the roster, who's getting the playing time. After this season, it's really shifts, right? This is the last year where it's going to have this group. So again, I have 11 starters. We're going to get into that group in the next segment, but where most of that is, right? It's secondary, it's offensive line, and it's defensive line. So it's in the trenches, and it's a couple of the best players on the team. Now, like I said, multiple things can be true here. I think Paul Chryst obviously left a lot of pieces and talent, but there are also areas where, this linebacker group, there's very few vestiges outside of a couple guys we're going to talk about of Paul Chryst in that group. The receivers have been overhauled. The quarterbacks have been overhauled, right? So there are places, the special teams have been overhauled. There are places where, there are not many traces of that previous coaching staff left. But again, I wouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's still a lot of talent on this roster inherited from the previous regime that's going to have to play really, really well this season if the Badgers are going to hit that 8-9 win mark. And if they don't, what's the narrative? Is the narrative Paul Chryst didn't leave enough in the cupboard, or is the narrative start to shift more towards Luke Fickell? And why aren't we improving at a quicker rate? I think it's an interesting discussion to follow. I don't think we're going to have to dive too much into that this season, because I do think we're going to win 8 games this year. And I do think we're going to be more competitive. And I do think that group of Chryst veterans and this younger group of Luke Fickell transfers and recruits are going to meld better this year. I think the vision's going to be clearer. There's going to be more buy-in. I'm really excited for it. All right, we're going to take a quick break for our friends of the show. Come back and talk about those kind of 11 starters, 4 or 5 two-deep guys. Pick out a couple key players in that group from that Paul Chryst era. That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. But first, a quick break for our friends of the show over at FanDuel. FanDuel is your number one source for all of your sports betting needs and information. Everything you need from a sportsbook. It's the official sportsbook of the Locked On Network. It's what I use. Fast, easy, simple to get your money, easy interface to get around in, parlays, futures, teasers, spreads. Listen, that futures parlay, we're about 50 days, 50 days away from college football starting. That futures for the Wisconsin Badgers, where they have it at 7.5, 6.5, I think 7.5. Yeah. You're going to want to probably take the over on that. I think the Badgers are going to get to 8 wins. I'm pretty confident in that. I like what we have coming back, and I'm excited to do that. I'm going to put money on the Badgers on the over at FanDuel.com. It is a great place for all of your sports betting needs, FanDuel.com right now. Okay, let's continue on. All right, so let's talk about the players that the Paul Chryst era. Let's run down that list. Let's run down the players that were recruited under Paul Chryst in that era, and just get a feel for the talent that's coming back, right? You're talking about guys. These are guys that I think are either locked in as starters or probably starters. So you have Chez Mellusi, Riley Nowakowski, Jack Nelson, Joe Brunner, Riley Mahlman, Curtis Neal, James Thompson, Jake Chaney, Austin Brown, Hunter Wohler, Ricardo Hallman. And then there's a whole list of guys who, I think, Ben Barton, JP Benzwall, Barrett Nelson could play some depth, Vinny Anthony. There's a lot of players when you start looking at the two deep that are going to factor into there as well from who Paul Chryst recruited. So you look at this list, and instantly it's 3/5 of the offensive line, right? Jack Nelson, Mahlman, and Joe Brunner. It's Riley Nowakowski probably starting. It's the starting running back in Chez Mellusi. It's you're talking about most of the defensive line, right? JT Thompson, Curtis Neal, and then a couple of guys that I think are really interesting at the linebacker spot, like Daryl Peterson, Jake Chaney. Jake Chaney, I want to highlight. Jake Chaney is literally one of my favorite guys on the team. I talked about him last year. There was so much criticism, especially as the season went on last year with the linebacker core in general. Why aren't we more disruptive? Why are we struggling on the edges? Why do we look so unathletic? I repeatedly said last year, I think Chaney's the exception to this. He missed some tackles in moments, but I thought he was the best of that group. I thought he looked more explosive, quicker, better anticipation, did a better job getting into the backfield than any of those guys. Had 3 sacks last year. I thought Chaney was the best of that group, and I thought at times he got unfairly kind of lumped into a positional group that wasn't strong enough, that was a little maligned. And the fact that we brought in all these transfer linebackers, right? You look at the list in the offseason, we were rattling them off. It's like a shooting gallery. There's like Tackett Curtis, bing. Jaheim Thomas, bing. Sebastian Cheeks, bing. John Pius, bing. Leon Lauer, bing. We were just get one after another, like knocking them down. And you were starting to talk about, well, which linebackers are leaving, right? If you're getting all of this talent in, I bet you Jake Chaney leaves and Peterson and da-da-da. And these guys stayed. They stayed to compete. And I respect the hell out of that. Both Peterson and Chaney have really had great off seasons. They've impressed the staff. Brady Collins has raved about them. I'm telling you right now, Jake Chaney's wired the right way. I've talked to his dad. He's the type of guy who, I asked his dad straight up, his dad who's now on the Colorado Buffalo staff, who used to coach high school football. I asked him, when Paul Chryst left, was there ever any inclination in transferring for Jake Chaney? And his dad was just like, no, we compete in this family. Like we stay and we compete. And I think that's why you're seeing Jake Chaney really, despite all the talent come in, look like he's positioned himself to have a big role and probably a starting role this season. I think he's going to have a great year. I think he's going to stand out even among the transfer linebackers that we brought in. Now, it's going to be tough. There's a ton of playing time there, and I can't wait to see it. But I am so stoked for him, and I can't wait to see what he does in this defense this year. Daryl Peterson is another one. Stuck around. Paul Chryst guy, part of those really good recruiting classes that probably didn't live up to their hype. Daryl Peterson was a highly, highly, highly recruited edge defender in high school. Hasn't really clicked, but what have we heard this offseason? He's bought in. He's changed his body. He looks great. This is kind of what I talked about in the first segment, right? I don't think last year the buy-in, and this is no fault on the players. It just, it's weird. It's tough when you have that much transition. I think it was a feeling out process for the coaches and the players. And I expect this Paul Chryst group to be a little more locked in this year. I expect the results to be better. And again, that's not disparaging anybody in that group. I just think it was a transition year. And I don't believe that we talked about that enough, or we put enough brain power into, well, how is this going to look? How's the transition going to look? A couple more players I want to talk about specifically from that Paul Chryst group that I expect to maybe turn some eyes this year. Austin Brown's a guy. You look at a big physical safety. He's going to play a ton. I think, Kamoi Latu's back there. Obviously, Hunter Wohler. I just think Austin Brown gives you a level of physicality and size and speed that we haven't had a ton of there. And the way Kamoi Latu sometimes last year overran tackles, had some poor reads, just went for kill shots kind of, right? He was the guy coming downhill trying to make the highlight hit when sometimes you need to make the safe tackle. I think Austin Brown might take a lot of those reps this year. And I can't wait to see him, obviously. And then the two probably biggest stars on the team right now, EA Sports, the only two guys in the top 100 in the EA Sports rankings, Ricardo, Hallman, and Hunter Wohler. Again, both Paul Chryst guys. So a lot of talent that was left over. You go through the list, a lot of talent on the lines, a lot of talent in the secondary, and it's going to be a really interesting year. All right, we're going to take a quick break, talk about Big Ten Media Days, also get a couple of your questions in here. Actually, let's take one of those questions right now. Questions or thoughts from previous YouTube shows. This is from Mark. So I did a show talking about USC, saying I don't think they're ready for the Big Ten. Mark said, I'm afraid this show won't age well in regards to the USC comments, basically telling me I might need to be a little careful about what I say about USC. He said, would you consider Wisconsin a physical team? I wouldn't last year, Mark. I would not last year, but I consider the Big Ten a physical conference, right? And those are the teams that USC has struggled against. So I was physical. I think Wisconsin is going to be more physical this year with a more established offense line. But Iowa, like some of the schools that USC is going to have to play are physical, and they're going to get them back to back to back at points. I think they're going to get beaten up a little bit. Maybe I'm wrong. everybody feel free to clip this if I'm way off base on my USC is not ready for the physicality of the Big Ten take, but I don't think I'm going to be fully wrong on that. This is from Dirk W. He said, watch film on Pius, Lowry, and Thomas. I think this would be the most athletic and disruptive linebacker unit since Barry Alvarez was the head coach. Let's go, Dirk. I love the optimism. He said it's going to be unrecognizable from last year. So, yes, on the latter point, it will be unrecognizable from last year. I mean, keep in mind, we had guys like, and God love him, like Muma Nanjameta. He ran like a 4.8, like getting a lot of reps. Like that's just, we're going to have so much more speed on the field this year. It is going to be unrecognizable from last year. When we start talking about most athletic and disruptive since Barry, that's really tough when you go back and look at some of the linebacker groupings we've had. I mean, certainly you have pairings with like Chanel and Herbig. You have pairings with oh man, there have been so many. TJ Edwards in the middle with I'm trying to think of the outside linebacker with the long flowing blonde hair who plays for the Dolphins now. I can't think of his name. It's killing me. Anyway, I will think of it in literally a second. But then you had TJ Watt on an edge. You had Zach Bond on an edge. And I think he had maybe Chris Orr in the middle. Like there are so many pairings. I'd almost have to go back and look. But this could be the most athletic group in a long time. Disruptive, we have to see, right? Because athleticism doesn't always translate. That's a thing I've cautioned people a little bit this year. There's a lot of new pieces at linebacker that are really fun and really exciting. They have to find a way to mesh that group. The coaching staff is going to have to find a way to find the optimal roles for these guys, and they're going to have to, acclimate to a new system. A lot of these transfers coming in, acclimating to new systems, new schemes. Now, obviously, a guy like Jaheim Thomas, who was previously with Cincinnati, and this coaching staff probably has a head start on that, but yeah, this linebacker group is going to be a ton of fun. I don't disagree with you there. Okay, well, let's take a quick break here. We're going to come back and talk Big Ten Media Days, who Wisconsin is sending, why I get the fact that there's not a quarterback in the group, but why long-term there needs to be a quarterback in that group. That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. But first, a quick break for our friends of the show. Today's friends of the show brought to you by over at eBay Motors. The right parts, the right fit, the right prices. eBay Guaranteed Fit is an incredible tool if you are a gearhead or if you're just somebody who needs a quick part that you can slap on. You're talking parts for the tires, audio parts, rims, spark plugs, whatever you need for your car. They have over 122 million parts for your car. That's insane. That's absolutely insane. That's how many rushing yards Ron Dane had. So if you want to find the right parts for your car, your ride or die, and you got to keep it alive, please go over to eBay Motors. That's where I go when I want parts because I don't want to go into a store and talk to some dude who's just coming back from his smoke break, who doesn't even want to look in the warehouse for the parts I need. I can just go to eBay Motors. I can be that dude that finds the parts. That's what I'm going to do. Go over to eBay Motors, the right parts, the right fit, the right prices. Keep your ride or die alive over at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Okay, let's talk Big Ten Media Days. Wisconsin announced they are sending 3 players, 3 veterans. And it's funny, we just got done talking about like the Paul Chryst guys. These are all Paul Chryst guys. Jake Chaney, who I've raved about, I just talked about. I absolutely love him. Leader, physical, tough, competitor, reshaped his body. I love Jake Chaney. That's a great inclusion. They're also sending Jack Nelson and Hunter Wohler. Hunter Wohler's obvious. Hunter Wohler is the face of the defense. He's got to go. I was kind of curious if they'd send Rico. Rico's just a junior, but he's a guy who certainly could leave after this year. But you got to send Hunter Wohler. You absolutely have to send him. So that's an obvious one. I want to talk about Jack Nelson for a second. Jack Nelson's interesting to me because there probably wasn't a more maligned guy at times within the fan base than Jack Nelson last year. Some false starts, a really rough game against Washington State on the road. That was probably his low point of the year. The fact that he's going, he came back, he's reshaped his body a little bit as well. Brady Collins likes what he did this offseason. The fact that he's going to Big Ten Media Days, it really makes me feel like the staff thinks he fully bought in. Not that he never did. I'm not putting that out there whatsoever, but you like seeing the bounce back from a year where it was maybe a little tough, new coaching staff. A lot of kids in this era of college football would probably be like, I'm just going to go somewhere else. Instead, it really sounds like he bought in, built back up, and did enough. The coach was like, yeah, you're going to media days. You're one of the core leaders on this team, because only the dudes that fit the culture, that fit the expectations, that show up in the workouts, that are leaders, that are recognized as leaders within the locker room, those are the guys that go to media days, right? You don't get this for doing nothing. So the fact that Jack Nelson, who should be one of the leaders on the team, one of the veterans on the team, one of the more physically gifted guys on the team, the fact that he's going, I think, is a great sign. Let's talk about no quarterback. So this year makes sense. Like I don't want to make a mountain out of a tiny little molehill right here. Tyler Van Dyke is still technically still in a battle with Braden Locke. It makes sense that you don't have a quarterback going to Big Ten media days. However, this is also reflective of the state of the position, right? Because if you want to be a really good team, you typically need to have a quarterback that is good enough and is kind of a face of the program type guy that ends up going to media days, if that makes sense. Like let me put it another way. If in a couple years we still haven't developed a quarterback that we're sending to media days, I think it's a problem. Like in a couple years, I expect to see Landon Locke or Mabry Metoyer going to Big Ten media days, because your quarterback has, if you want to be a truly great program, unless we're talking about like, I don't know, like the Baltimore Ravens led by Ray Lewis, where they had Trent Dilfer at quarterback and it didn't matter. But most teams, 99% of football teams, if you're going to be great, your quarterback has to be great. And it's just a spot where Wisconsin has got to get better, right? We're in year 2 of another stopgap. I understand why. I think Tyler Van Dyke could be fine. But after this, you really need to start developing that younger talent. You really need to have the Landon Locke, the Braden Locke, the Mabry Metoyer, the Cole LaCrue, whoever it may be, take that next step and kind of start to take the reins and become a multi-year guy, so that you see those guys going to media day. Because your quarterback needs to be one of your leaders. It just has to be. He has to be one of your faces of the franchise. He just has to be. So do I think it's a big deal that there's no bad? It doesn't matter this year that there's no Badgers quarterbacks going to Big Ten media days. But I think that trend, if Wisconsin is going to become a really good program, that trend does have to reverse at some point. Anyway, really do appreciate everybody tuning in. Thank you so much for joining us on Locked On Badgers. Thank you so much for making this one of your first listens every single day. When you're done here, go check out Locked On Brewers. Go check out what's going on in the baseball world. Locked On Packers as well. Locked On Bucks. We got you covered from every angle for all your sports needs over in the Locked On Network. This is Locked On Badgers. I'm your host, Ryan Harings, and we will talk tomorrow.